Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Jane Demy, and I am the founder and CEO of Demy-Colton here in New York City. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 15th installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon series and our very first salon of 2021. Today's topic is Gain Your Commercial Edge, Define Your Value Story Early. As some of you know, Demy-Colton's mission is all about convening biopharma and digital medicine industry leaders to catalyze change. We know we help drive innovation when we bring individuals together who are united by a common cause and a shared passion. And in our industry, that cause and passion is bringing therapeutics and cures to people in need. As those of you who have attended our past salons know, Demy-Colton was in the process of launching BioFuture, our new international investor and business development meeting here in New York City when COVID-19 hit and changed everything about what we do, as I'm sure it changed everything about what you do. So in lieu of an in-person BioFuture meeting, we shifted and launched the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon series to continue our mission of bringing people together with great information and informative content. Before we get underway today, I would like to acknowledge and thank Triangle Insights, a diamond sponsor of our Virtual Salon series, as well as our founding BioFuture sponsors for their ongoing support. At Demy-Colton, we believe the Virtual Salon series will be here to stay even after we get back to a new normal. Please do check our website for the schedule of salons, fireside chats, topics, and participants. It is evolving constantly, and of course, I encourage you to suggest topics and to join us at future salons. A note about the structure of today's program. The formal portion of the discussion will last approximately 50 minutes, and it will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A period. You can submit your questions in the Ask a Question pane below the screen, and we will address as many as possible. And of course, it will be easier to address questions if they are as concise as possible, as I'm sure you understand. Please note that this salon will be recorded and it will be available for on-demand viewing later today. Additional materials can be viewed in the Event Resources tab where you logged in. Today's virtual salon, as I mentioned earlier, Gain Your Commercial Edge, Define Your Value Story Early, will be moderated by Gautam Agarwal, a founding partner at Triangle Insights Group. And he is joined by Judy Campagnari, head of STAR, and she'll tell you what STAR stands for, Patient Experience Team at Alexion Pharmaceuticals. Wills Hughes-Wilson, Chief of Patient Access and Commercial Planning at Mereo Biopharma Group. Lorenz Muller, Chief Commercial Officer of Milestone Pharmaceuticals. And Peter Pitts, President and co-founder of the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest. Welcome all. We are pleased that all of you could join us here today. Full bios for everyone are on the website. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the virtual podium microphone over to Gautam. Gautam, it is yours to take. Can't hear Gautam.
Again, sorry. Thanks to Sarah and Demy-Colton Group for organizing the salon, and thanks to the audience for joining this discussion. We'll make sure to leave plenty of time at the end of the discussion to get to some of the questions from the audience as well. As Sarah mentioned, I'm your moderator for the session, and we'll start with detail. Before that, I did want to share some thoughts regarding the reason for our conversation today. We here at Triangle Insights feel that the shift towards value is finally real and has started to have a significant impact on innovation, investment, and commercial performance within the pharmaceutical space. Companies that don't innovate on value will struggle and will likely not be able to succeed. To support this, I provide three recent examples. Dupixent, which is a novel monoclonal antibody that competes within a crowded generic space of steroids, did a fabulous job of engaging with ICER pre-approval, which resulted in favorable coverage, realistic pricing expectations, high access, and an incredible amount of commercial success very much from the beginning. On the other hand, CGRPs, also a very innovative class of products that competed against generic triptans, missed set expectations and had to reduce pricing by more than 30%. We see these trends even in spaces in the oncology space. For example, Keytruda recently was rejected by the NICE because they did not have sufficient data for a kidney cancer indication. With that set up, I would like to start to introduce myself. I started off in industry at GlaxoSmithKline and have been a career consultant for the last 20 years to biopharmaceutical companies. I work for a Triangle Insights Group. It's a boutique consulting firm focusing on the pharma industry. We help clients make informed strategic decisions. This means helping them with drug development priorities based on an understanding of concepts like value, helping companies evaluate pricing expectations and or commercial expectations, helping companies communicate that value to stakeholders. Please take a look at our recent white paper and more information about Triangle Insights under the Event Resources tab. With that, I'd like to turn to Judy first for more of an intro and then to the other folks. Judy?
Thanks, Gautam. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join this important conversation. My name is Judy Campaneri, and I work for Alexion Pharmaceuticals, where I head up a team called STAR. STAR is an acronym that stands for Solutions to Accelerate Results. And one of Alexion's primary ambitions is to be very patient-focused. And so my team is responsible for identifying patient insights and forming strategies that help Alexion deliver results for patients. Probably the easiest way to explain my team is we're Alexion's patient-centered think tank. Prior to joining Alexion in June 2014, I was a member of Pfizer Pharmaceuticals commercial organization where I had several roles of responsibility. I started my career at Pfizer in a group called Market Assessment, which was a commercial organization that was embedded within our research and development organization. And then over time, grew up in the commercial organization where I ended my career at Pfizer before coming to Alexion as a member of the Pfizer Pharmaceuticals commercial team that supported the business development, acquisitions, mergers, and licenses. And prior to Pfizer, I started my career as a management consultant with what was called Anderson Consulting, now Accenture. So over my career, I've been engaged in the biopharmaceutical area in some way or another for the last 27 years. Thank you, Gautam.
Great. Let's move to Wells.
Thank you, Gautam, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this panel. I'm excited for this conversation because it's an important topic. My name's Wills Hughes-Wilson. I'm responsible for commercial planning and patient access, which is market access in a lot of other companies, but we believe you only actually make the sale once you get the product to the patient. And that's at Mereo Biopharma, based in London, a startup, which is about 5 years old. I've been with the company for 3 years. Our focus is primarily on rare diseases and oncology, and rare diseases are my particular area of passion and also experience. Prior to Mereo, I was with Swedish orphan Biovitrum up in Stockholm, taking care of a broad portfolio of orphan products, and prior to that, several years at Genzyme, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. So thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Wells. Let's move on to Lorenz.
Yes, hello, everyone. My name is Lorenz Muller. I'm currently the commercial officer at Milestone Pharmaceuticals. We are a phase 3 cardiovascular company working toward commercializing and launching our first product. Our focus is in episodic arrhythmias, and we're developing what we believe is a paradigm-shifting approach to be able to take patients that normally have to go to the acute care setting to treat their arrhythmias and empower them to be able to treat those in the comfort of their own home. Prior to that, I'd spent the last 25 years developing and commercializing primarily cardiovascular therapeutics, although I've also worked in diagnostics and oncology. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thanks, Lorenz. Peter?
Thanks, Gautam, and hello, everybody. My name is Peter Pitts. I'm the president of a small think tank called the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest. I'm a former FDA Associate Commissioner, and I'm also a visiting professor at the University of Paris Medical School. And I think my job here is to share some thoughts relative to how regulatory and market access and value writ large really is an ecosystem. We've learned so much from COVID-19, that's certainly part of it, and how that if you don't understand all the pieces of the puzzle, the piece that you understand the best is oftentimes can send you in the wrong direction. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you to the panelists for, first of all, their time today, but also for sharing the incredible backgrounds and expertise that you bring to the table and to this conversation. So thank you again for that. I'll start off with a conversation or a question focused on the difference between pricing and value. And we very deliberately were focusing on the concept of value for this discussion, but I wanted to get the perspective of the panelists today in terms of what is the difference between pricing and value, and how should folks be thinking about pricing the products that they're developing on. I'll start off with Judy, maybe. Judy, did you want to address that first?
Thanks, Gautam. Yeah, when I think about price and value, I'm always drawn to a quote that Warren Buffett had made, which Warren Buffett said that price is what you pay, but value is what you get. And I think that's how we really need to be thinking about the concept of value as we think about our medicines. Because it's very easy to focus on the price in terms of return on investment and doing the simple calculation of X number of patients times Y price gets you to ROI. But before you can price your product, you really have to understand what is the meaning of the product? What's the vision? What is the vision of the product in terms of the clinical benefit, in terms of the outcome that you hope that the person who takes that medicine would receive? And therefore, what will that benefit translate to? What does that mean for the patient? What does that mean for the payer? What does that mean for the doctor? And I think that, so for me, I always want to focus on that, translating that vision into value, because the value being translated into a benefit and what that means for the person who you are trying to impact, that key stakeholder, that helps to set out a solid foundation to then you can discuss what price means and what price could be for your product.
I think, Judy, kind of that perspective on how value should influence pricing, I think is very important. Lorenz, kind of any additional thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I think it's, to the broader public, many times people conflate price with value. And I think when we don't do a good job, especially in biopharmaceuticals, but in general, we don't do a good job defining and proving the value of our products with evidence-based approach, then oftentimes we're left only to compete on price. So if you take the extreme of a generic product, which has a very important role in society, but generic products essentially compete on price because they're, by definition, no different from their competitors in any other way. So investing early and understanding the value to the various stakeholders, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, allows you to appropriately price products. But it's much more than just the price. That's just a typical way of measuring value in a very objective sense.
Great. Wills, any thoughts maybe kind of from your background in terms of how historically companies have thought about pricing and value, and how do you see it evolving?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, the comments we've had so far. I think obviously it's critical to be able to articulate your value. And I think that historically, companies have typically done this in what I would say is maybe an ivory tower way. So we have lots of very, very smart people doing very, very smart things, but on their own in a building somewhere, maybe in Boston or San Francisco or even London. And so the companies decide what's value. It's this idea, I know what my product is, I know what it's worth, and then we emerge and we tell our customers what the value is and therefore what the price will be. And I think it's more important when we think about value, it's essentially in the eye of the beholder, to change a quote. And so that value will be different for the patients, it will be different for the physicians, it will be different for the payers. But ultimately, we need to be able to articulate that value and in a real way to all of those audiences, and particularly to the payers, because they're going to be the ones that say yes or no to the price. So if you don't understand what they want and you don't understand what they need in order to reach their decision, you're not going to be able to craft and deliver your value story convincingly.
Excellent. And let's have Peter kind of chime in on this as well, and maybe kind of perspective as sitting on the other side of the desk sometimes as a regulatory person, but also kind of perspectives on pricing versus value from you, Peter, would be interesting.
Thanks. I have a new book out called The Value Equation, available on Amazon. And the reason I'm calling it the value equation is because we have to understand where value fits relative to the math. When you read the newspaper or go to policy conversations or talk to politicians or regulators, oftentimes price is viewed as the denominator of the conversation, and that's wrong. Value is the denominator. And to my mind, there's only one very clear first principle definition of value, which is enhanced therapeutic outcomes. Everything else is an above-the-line item, price included, and all of those above-the-line items are very important because, as we've already discussed, coming up with a solution that is elegant and that works well, that misses on lots of other points, is a non-starter. So unless you understand value initially as enhanced therapeutic outcomes, but making sure that you understand that enhancing outcomes needs to be done in a smart and savvy way that ticks all the other boxes as well, which kind of is where ICER falls down, but where NICE, for example, has accelerated, kind of past the quality to more value-based conversations that we're now learning about in the US. We have a more holistic view, and that's important for lots of reasons, not the least of which from a financial perspective is you want to reward and enhance and facilitate innovation. And unless innovation is rewarded, you don't get it, and that would be a horrible thing.
Great. Let's move on to a question, or at least, and I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for about 20 years now, and the construct of value has been discussed for those 20 years, I'm sure for 20 years before that. But it seems like, at least as we look at the market, that the focus on value is potentially becoming more relevant in the US pharmaceutical space, where historically we were a market which allowed for essentially free pricing. But more recently, especially for therapeutics that are a bit more on the expensive side, we see the focus on value becoming a lot more important. What makes the conversation more real in your perspective? And do you agree with the hypothesis? Maybe Judy, your perspectives on that question would be great.
Yeah, I think this conversation is more real and more important because, to follow up on what Peter just said, it's because of innovation. We're seeing a lot of very innovative therapeutics being discovered, being commercialized, where ideas that would never have been possible, gene therapy, for example, we're seeing these now coming into the marketplace or up for consideration. And it's no longer easy or enough to say that the patient is not going to die. That, of course, is absolutely what we aspire for when we are developing a medicine. But the bigger question is, what's the return from actually the choices that a patient and along with their physician might be making? So I think that this value story is pushing us to get away from, I like the concept of saying simple math, because the types of outcomes and the way we're measuring and the benefit that patients are able to get and quite frankly, the benefits that the patients should expect requires that we are more clear about the benefit, the outcome, the results that they're getting from our medicines. And so I think that this where, when I started in the industry, it was really a focus on price because we had very little innovation. The innovation was, if you will, generally, this is a gross generalization, but it was, a lot of conversations about how to take a drug from being 3 times a day to twice a day or maybe BID. And then we got into an area where the science started to explode and we started seeing some really great innovative products that were opened and that should have been made available to a lot more patients, such as the statins, such as the products like Januvia, which really changed the way that we could look at diabetes. And as you look at that bigger group of patients being treated, and you look and think about the innovation, we really need to be moving away from, I like, again, this concept, simple math, to saying, here's the benefit, here is the value, and the reason that a patient should be treated with this innovative product versus the generic. So I think that that's what we're seeing here, and that's what has made this explode so much.
You know, there's another point I think that ties right into that, which is the voice of the patient. You know, in the past, the so-called patient voice was patient as teller of sad stories, and there's a place for that. But certainly through programs like the FDA's patient-focused drug development program, patient groups that are now sophisticated enough to understand the regulatory process, for example, are changing the dynamic of, for example, endpoints. You know, a traditional endpoint, like the 6-minute walk test for a certain subset of diseases, is a traditional endpoint. And patients are saying, no, that's not right at all. We want you to consider more quality of life data points. And that's really changing the thing, because patients are willing to accept often, you know, what a reviewer might view as tertiary benefits at higher risk, and patients are excited about that. And for payers, it's the same thing. You know, payers have to understand what the patient wants to get paid to have. And so it becomes more complicated, but that's a good thing. It becomes more three-dimensional.
Yeah, Pete, thank you for bringing it up, because that, quite frankly, what you've just articulated is the reason my group exists. If we don't hear and understand the patient voice, and not just hear it, but use that patient voice to make decisions, to help form our strategies, then we're missing the opportunity to truly understand, again, what's the value and how can we demonstrate that benefit.
And Gautam, if I could add, having a great value proposition is clearly important. It's essential. But if you don't prepare stakeholders well ahead of time for that value proposition, you can also fail. And I'll give us a case study for this. What Gilead did with what was an amazing innovation, which was a cure for Hep C, Sovaldi, which was a great product, had honestly a great value proposition, but they did not appropriately prepare payers for the price point and the adoption that was going to occur, and it blindsided them, and it completely blew up their budgets, from large commercial payers to Medicare payer, everyone. And so as a result of that, they were accused for a long time of not providing value, even though their price point in retrospect was actually quite appropriate for something that cures a disease that has high morbidity and mortality. So, and the sequelae of that for all the rest of us that are now trying to commercialize drugs is the way that payers approach new drugs. It used to be they'd cover you for 6 months, evaluate you, and then decide how they're going to place you in a tier. Nowadays, more often than not, they exclude you from formulary or coverage even until they evaluate you, which can be 6 months to a year, and then they put you into an appropriate tier. So that's a really important lesson to remember when you're in this process.
So Sovaldi is an amazing example, because it really is that rare circumstance of discontinuous innovation. And if we didn't reward it through smart reimbursement, you wouldn't have gotten a relatively quick competition to it, at which point all the prices come down. So again, these things are all linked together.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about kind of some of the concepts I'm hearing in terms of the fact that innovation nowadays has changed from, like, the example of going from BID to QD to cell and gene therapy, where you sometimes are truly talking about saving lives of patients. And one of the questions we just even got on the Q&A was, how do you value that? How do you value the life? And I know, kind of, Peter, you talked about ICER and NICE and discussions of qualities, but how do you price something which could be life-saving? And what do you need to do in drug development to make sure that you're thinking through that early enough to be able to have that proof as you think about pricing products that potentially could be hundreds or thousands of dollars, if not potentially more? Let's go to, for that question, maybe we go to Will's first.
Yeah, thank you, Gautam. So Mereo is involved in small molecules and monoclonal antibodies. So we're not involved in cell and gene therapy. That said, I think there are principles that we can apply, and that we certainly should apply, particularly in rare diseases. Because the concept of what value a life, what price a life, has been a long-running story in the rare disease space. And I believe that the thing that I would advocate is to start having the conversations as early on with your stakeholders as you possibly can. And traditionally, I think we see CEOs and leadership teams focusing on the comfort zone stakeholders, if I can put it like that, the regulators, and the investors, of course. And they're less comfortable going off to talk in, I would say, unstructured areas. So when we go to the FDA and the EMA, it's a very clear pathway. You have a very clear toolbox of BTD or of Prime, things that you can call upon. And it's up to you to decide which ones you use, but they're all there and it's clear and it's structured. But when you want to go and start talking to the payers, where's the forum to do that? When you go and talk to the patients, where's the forum to do that? And how do you have a structured conversation with the physicians outside the traditional ad board? And the answer is, of course, there isn't a playbook for that, and certainly not for a very novel cutting-edge product. You have to make it up yourself. And I think that's why sometimes those early dialogues to try and understand how you're going to craft your value story by bringing it outside in is rather more uncomfortable for companies. And maybe that's one of the reasons they don't do it so easily.
And Lorenz, maybe some thoughts from you in terms of how can you start to engage with some of that external audience early on? And who should you be having conversations with to understand kind of what really the external world's perspective is on value, kind of the eyes of the beholder? What do the various stakeholders think?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Gautam, and it's kind of unique to our industry where we don't just have one customer. When you're buying Bounty paper towels, it's the customer that decides what they want, makes the decision to purchase, buys it, and then uses it. In our industry, the person who actually uses our products generally only pays for a small portion of them and has almost no influence generally over which product they get. People that have the decision-making authority, the physicians, have no idea about price, don't pay for it, but have authority over which products used, and then ultimately the people that are left with the with the bank account paying for things have really very little choice as well over which therapy gets used. So the point of my story here is that you have to engage all of these different stakeholders and understand their unique perception of value, both related to the outcomes, which is critical, as Peter had suggested earlier, but then also the price, which is a determinant of whether or not they will use it. And so investing in that, I think either Judy or Will said this earlier, starting very early on, like around about the time of proof of concept, when you know you have some activity, starting to understand at a very rudimentary level, what are the determinants of value by the different stakeholders, and be prepared that they are going to be quite different across those variant stakeholder groups, even within a therapeutic category or across therapeutic categories.
Also, the whole concept of reimbursement and value has changed, because first we had small molecules, then we had biologics, and now we have cell and gene therapies, and they can't all be dealt with in identical ways. So one of the problems is we don't really have the nomenclature to have these conversations across different types of therapies. And for example, what does curative even mean? It means different things to different people. We have to invent new models. The Netflix model, for example, is getting a lot of conversation. That's going to be relevant for one category, but not for another. Just as the therapies are becoming more complicated from a molecular discussion perspective, so too are the reimbursement models. One size does not fit all.
Well, I think that part of the problem here is also the science, and that we, if I think specifically about gene therapy, the science is still evolving as to your point, Peter, what is the definition of curative? There are some studies that show that some gene therapies are absolutely curative in the definition of the word, that the patient no longer suffers. But there are other studies that I've seen where the effect is not long-term, meaning lifelong. It is maybe 5 or 10 years, and the science is still evolving here. So I think that that's part of the problem with the pricing conversation and the value conversation when you look at these very novel, leading-edge therapeutics, such as gene and cell therapy, is that the science is still not at a place where we can start making some determinative decisions from the business perspective.
I think it's an interesting point, right? I think we were talking a little bit about the durability of some of the cures that potentially are coming with some of the products in development, like cell and gene therapy. And I think it is an interesting point of, first of all, there is uncertainty in terms of how durable some of these treatments truly will be. But at the same time, there's the hint of the possibility that if you think about a quality framework, and if you think about a framework of saving lives, some of these therapeutics could be 500,000, maybe based on some recent analogs, $2 million, depending on how durable the therapeutic is. How does that work within the payer system that we have today, where a patient may be on a United Healthcare for a year or 2 years and then move on to a Kaiser or another payer? And then kind of Peter started talking about the Netflix consumption model. And maybe Peter, going to turn this to you first again, is a bit more, how do you see that playing when you're looking at these really expensive therapeutics that could come to the market, which may be very bulky in terms of the spend that they may have for any particular plans?
Well, I think, even before you get to that, you have to recognize that the ability of various regulatory agencies, really right now, the FDA, EMA, MHRA, the more developed systems, to license products either fully or provisionally, as the case may be, based on a very truncated data set, but a more robust post-marketing data collection, license discussion. A lot of payers are saying, what, this is a neat molecule, but we believe that it was licensed without robust data, therefore we're not going to reimburse it. So you have payers now all of a sudden deciding that they can tend to other people's knitting. From a Netflix model, you're thinking about, well, what about companies that don't have a broad portfolio of products that a Netflix model can cover? So it really needs to, the whole problem really needs to reckon with, a discomfort with the price and what is the value of that price. So it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. Developers and regulators and payers need to recognize what the value is, and that's far from clear. It isn't simply speaking the marketing language that's used by the developer. It has so many different pieces, and unless all of that is developed early on in the proposition, well before a large phase 3 study, for example, we're going to keep hitting these roadblocks. You need some type of a consensus relatively early in the proposition before you press the go, no go button.
Thoughts from others in terms of how do they expect some of these high therapeutic spaces to evolve and get reimbursed within the U.S. healthcare system? Maybe Judy, if you have some thoughts.
Well, I'm pausing because I don't know that I have anything more to add to Peter, because I focus on the science, and I think that until we have a better sense of the outcomes, it's hard to have the pricing conversation. But Lorenz, I would defer to you.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, when we talk about developing therapeutics, we often think about treating a patient, and certainly a physician doesn't think about treating a population. They think about one patient in front of them, trying to help them. But from the payer standpoint, it's all in a capitalist society. It's all about budgets and how much is this new therapy going to cost me per year for the size of the population. So the trade-off, my point is, the trade-off between deciding on a $2 million price tag and whether to cover it for a disease that where a given payer, Aetna or United or someone, might see 1 or 2 patients a year because it's so rare, that's a much easier decision, and from a financial standpoint, to cover than something like a novel PCSK9, which could potentially treat millions of people with hypercholesterolemia, and at a price point of $14,000 or $15,000 a year. And by the way, that's a chronic therapy, not a curative therapy. That trade-off, from a payer standpoint, they're much more likely, in my opinion, to cover the rare disease therapeutic with a 7-figure price tag than something that potentially is a budget buster like Sovaldi was, back to the previous conversation.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Wills.
No, sorry, I was just going to say, but building on what you were just saying, Lorenz, and that hard discussion with the payers, one thing I think that I've also observed, and I'm sure we all have over recent years, is that payers are increasingly willing to say no. And I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was commonplace to tell the sad story, as Peter said. The patient is sad and it's in the media, and suddenly the decision is reversed. I think we're seeing now, even when the regulators are authorizing a broad label, the payers are actually going to the data and saying, well, you only have a data set for this subset, so I'm only going to reimburse for this subset. And they're not afraid anymore of standing their ground and saying, this is the reason we've taken a decision, and we're taking it on the basis of data. and no, we're not going to be swayed by a PR campaign in the media. So I think the payers are becoming much stronger and much tougher, and maybe that's because of the result of large indications or small indications with high price tags and the budget impact that they're looking at when they open their books.
You raise an interesting point, Wills, which is condition-specific reimbursements. We have so many products on the market now and coming through the pipeline that will initially be approved for a relatively narrow indication, but very quickly become standard of care for others. So that I think has to be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah.
Let's also maybe talk a little bit about, we've been talking about the R&D aspect of value. And there are some references during the discussion also about as products get commercialized, and to Peter's example of indication-specific pricing, what about pay for performance? What about value after approval? Does the panel expect that that's going to be more normal in the U.S. market in the future, where you get approval, but maybe you only get money as a manufacturer if the drug ends up working in the specific patient, and that could have different mechanisms in terms of how that actually gets deployed. But do you see a world in the future where pay for performance is much more part of, and let's actually maybe even answer this from a U.S. perspective and then from a European perspective. Curious to hear perspectives across the geographies. Maybe for that conversation, start off with Lorenz first, and then we'll ask it for a few other folks.
Yeah, it's a fascinating model that's been evolving, over a career of 20 or 25 years, like most of us had. Early on in our careers, there was no such thing as pay performance. It was all about establishing a price and then contracting and reducing your price and rebates in order to get preferred formulary positioning over your peers. And in many P&Ls for commercialized products, the rebate line was actually their single largest expense, for sort of chronic oral meds, traditional model. But nowadays, especially as we start getting to these much more expensive, much more rare diseases in terms of therapies, the idea of pay for performance, more and more payers are starting to embrace it. I know, as an example, I believe Novartis has some pay performance contracts with Entresto, which is their heart failure medication, that are fairly novel. The challenge that I see with those, and having been involved in discussions with payers in my past lives to try to structure those types of agreements, which on paper sound really good or in theory, but being able to actually measure that performance and document it in a time frame where the money actually transacts, because many times the data to be able to measure against the performance criteria for that contract are lagged by a month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. And in our sort of fiscal year society, that can become incredibly challenging to align on the metrics you're going to measure for that performance, and then to actually be able to collect the data, communicate it, reconcile it, and then actually transact money back and forth between the payer and the manufacturer. In my experience, that more often than not has scuttled the majority of those types of contracting discussions, even though the idea intellectually, academically, is a really, really interesting one.
Now, that's a really key point. I know the first time this crossed my radar screen was through NICE for a lung cancer medication. And what proved to be an incredibly thorny step was defining what success even means. I mean, it sounds simple, and it's not.
Wills, any thoughts on pay for performance, maybe even from a European perspective?
Yeah, well, that's very relevant because, of course, it's already happening in Europe, and it has been for a long time. And as Peter alluded to, one of the first ones was in the UK for an oncology medicine. I think one of the challenges beyond the definition of success and the logistics of, the financial logistics of implementing this is that they actually cost the payers themselves a lot to track. Mm-hmm. So the idea is intellectually to come in and save money and drive a hard bargain and get what they're paying for. But actually, the healthcare systems have realized that it's actually costing them a lot of money to administer those, and the savings, therefore, might not materialize. I think particularly with the novel therapies, the cell and gene, where we don't know the durability, the promise is there, or rare diseases with a truncated data set, they appear to make a lot of sense. And getting to patients with an agreed plan is better than not getting to patients at all. But I think the critical success factor is making the plan early, at the beginning, and not what typically tends to happen is you go through the reimbursement discussions, you get a no, and then people start scrambling to create a pay for performance as kind of a Band-Aid That's not the right way to go if you really want to make it successful. It should be factored in right from the very beginning, as some forward-thinking companies do have people thinking about this right at the very early stages of product development, and that's part of their launch strategy.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that the pay-for-performance concept is really best preserved for those rare diseases where a innovative therapy does have the potential to deliver great outcomes to the patient. I think that I don't see pay-for-performance as something that could be unilaterally used across all different types of therapeutics. I think the whole point is to accelerate the time and the availability of medicines for very rare conditions, these innovative products, and to share the risk across biopharmaceutical company as well as with payer. So I like the concept of pay for performance. I think it's a great model, but I think it's better utilized in very restricted types of therapeutics.
Let's shift gears a little bit, and then I'll actually ask a question related to, we talked about the patient convenience and how patient convenience potentially isn't being valued. And to some extent, as I think about that as a patient, I actually wonder, is that the right outcome? If some drug is coming to market that primarily has to focus just on patient benefit, does that still have value? Should that company still be developing that drug? I'm curious to hear people's perspectives on it. Maybe have Will provide a perspective on that, and we'll see if any other people have perspectives as well.
Yeah, so I think that's very interesting because very often we have a compound, and Judy, I think you have the greatest stories to tell about this, where in the lab the scientists or we can come with a product that intrinsically does something. It does something. So, for example, we were looking at a long-acting hemophilia factor, and the thing it did, its property was it stayed around in the blood longer. And that's an interesting scientific fact. But the question is then, what were we going to do with it? What was the so what for the patient? And the initial thought was, well, we could increase convenience. But that was actually us thinking what we could do for the patients. And we actually flipped it around and went to the community of hemophilia. People with hemophilia refer to themselves as people with hemophilia, not patients, and asked the community, what would make the most impact for you? What would you like to have this do? And it turned out they didn't want necessarily to drop an injection or have convenience. It was more that they were interested in having higher levels of activity, higher levels of protection. And so we designed the product using the scientific thing that it was doing to apply it in a different way. And I think that's the difference between an invention and innovation. So I think if we want to know what's important for the patients, we actually have to ask the patients and be guided by the patients. It can't be just a PR exercise.
Yeah, I think there's many.
There also has to be that the regulator has to recognize the value from an endpoint design perspective, because if we stipulate that a quality of life, if QOL data is significant, we somehow have to move the regulator off of kind of the traditional review of these medicines to a more holistic view of the benefit. PCSK9 is a great example, because clearly it's highly important for a very small subset of patients for whom statins don't work. But for the larger universe of patients that are simply not compliant, that's an important pharmacoeconomic conversation too, that this, for reasons beyond my expectations, never really gained any traction.
I think there's a difference between a patient that is being inconvenienced, or that a therapy that might be have a regimen that's challenging to maintain, versus demonstrating a benefit to a patient through either route of administration or through a mechanism. And in my experience, I've seen companies go the easy route, where they think that, for example, the greatest example is going from an IV infusion to sub-Q. And oftentimes I've worked with colleagues who have said that, well, we have to get to a sub-Q formulation because it's easier for the patient, without asking the question, to your point, Wills, well, what does the patient tell us? Years ago in my career, when I was working in oncology, and this was the point where we were looking at going from IV infusion oncology therapeutics to oral non-toxic therapies. And the rationale was that, well, patients don't like going to the infusion center. So I actually did some market research, and one of the things you found out was some patients, that's an absolute true statement. They don't want to go to the infusion center. It reminds them of their sickness, or it scares them. But some patients, the infusion center is really a source of a community. It's a strength for them. It helps, it provides them with like-minded people who are fighting a similar fight. And so to take them away from that in the means of convenience was actually very powerfully detrimental to these patients. So I think we need to be very careful about the concept of patient convenience and equating that to benefit. It goes back to understanding what the patients are telling us, taking that insight and using that to make decisions about an outcome that ultimately is a benefit to the person that it needs to benefit. And sometimes that benefit actually isn't the patient. Sometimes that benefit is the physician. You're providing the physician with a means to manage a disease that provides the patient with a better outcome. And ultimately, the patient and the physician are having an improved experience in this patient journey, if you will, of managing the disease. So I'm always a little skeptical when I hear somebody saying that something is going to be more convenient, because that might be what we perceive or what we as the drug developers think is of value, but it's not really what the patient or the payer or another key stakeholder might value.
That's right, Judy. I mean, the definition of convenience is really relevant here. And as a case study for this, I mean, our company is developing a nasal spray to treat these episodic arrhythmias that I mentioned a minute ago. So the benefit is right now, these patients, if they have one of these episodes and the rapid heart rate and it doesn't terminate by itself, they have to go to the emergency department. And so the convenience there in that scenario is, hours at the emergency department. This is even pre-COVID. You can imagine now they don't want to go. An unpleasant experience. It's costly typically if they have high deductible copays, et cetera. So that's to be able to avoid that by allowing a patient with evidence and safety to treat this arrhythmia when it happens, where it happens, in the comfort of their own home. That empowerment that the patient feels over their disease, that's, in our case, the definition of convenience. It's much more than convenience. It's an emotional benefit of being in control of your life rather than allowing the disease to control you.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I think what I'm hearing from the group is it's something beyond convenience. It needs to have some type of a quality of life impact. And if it has some quality of life impact, then it can have value. It doesn't just need to be related to something like completely survival, but there needs to be something that can be measured under a value framework, like you mentioned, Peter, as well, from a quality value perspective. Let's actually, and Lorenz, you talked about this earlier in terms of how early should a company be focusing on a value discussion around the proof of concept, if not earlier stage. I'm curious to hear other people's perspectives as well in terms of how early is too early, or when should a company begin to think about value? Is it post proof of concept? Is it from the first time you do human studies, or where in that spectrum would you put the focus on commercialization, the focus on value? Let's start off with maybe Judy first.
So let me ask your question a little differently, because I see the conversation of value not being about commercialization. And so for me, I'll disagree slightly with my panelists that I believe that the conversation of value needs to happen at the bench. When you're sitting down as a scientist and you're starting to think about that new therapeutic, that's a vision. And one of the things that I've loved about my career is to be able to work with scientists to translate that vision into value. And so understanding about if you're targeting a specific receptor or you're looking to reduce a endogenous protein for some reason, for me, the question I would ask is, so what? That's a very interesting scientific concept. That's a very powerful scientific demonstration. And then the question is, how do you take that scientific concept and translate that into a medical therapeutic? What's the so what? By reducing that protein or targeting that receptor, that does what? And that's where you start the value conversation in understanding your objective clinically and how that clinical objective, if achieved, is actually going to result in the patient's experience. So for me, I think that early for me is starting to partner in the research space and really trying to understand what's the future vision. That doesn't mean that you're commercializing. It doesn't mean that you're starting to put your marketing plans together, but it does mean that you've got a thought process laid out so that at the end of the day, as you start looking at your phase 1 studies, as you start planning your phase 2 studies, you're planning those studies all with the objective of meeting that vision of what this therapeutic product is going to do. So I like starting back at the bench.
And that's interesting. And one of the questions I sometimes struggle with, because I agree with, I think starting off almost at the beginning from a value perspective is important. But what if that message changes? As you're developing a product, you realize maybe it's not quite at that metric that you're expecting for it to be. And you're looking at investors and maybe you're communicating that value to investors or to the audience, to the street. So how overt should you be in terms of the value that you're expecting to have that you may be thinking about early? And Judy, I'll start off with you, but maybe after that, Wills as well.
Yeah, that's the balance. Of course, when you're talking to the street, when you're talking to investors, you can't share a lot of what is happening at the bench. That was right up there with making promises that you may not be able to keep. So I think that there is, I would elevate that conversation. Now you're talking about a more strategic conversation of the type of benefit that you're trying to demonstrate at a therapeutic level as opposed to maybe at the product level. But I think that these early conversations are, I think, very important because it also helps you to, and this is controversial if you will, but fail early. If a scientific concept is not going to end up being a medicinal product, then we should be endeavoring to fail quickly, fail early, meaning we understand at the earliest part of the development process whether or not this is really going to be an idea. I mean, in my career, I've seen candidates get to phase 3 and not meet their endpoints. That, I would assert, is too late. That should never happen. And so, you shouldn't be afraid to really start thinking about the value and how you're going to develop this scientific concept into a medicinal product and fail early if that's appropriate. But don't do that just because you're afraid or you don't want to. You may not have information to share with the street. I think that you can have information to share with the street about your strategic focus, the type of benefit you're trying to deliver, and still really start to put some structure around the vision that you have for your therapeutics.
Any other thoughts from anyone else on that question?
Just one thought on that is, you don't ask a grandparent if their grandchild is beautiful. You ask somebody else. Because let's face it, there are a lot of ugly babies out there. And I think as early in the process as possible, it's very important to get not necessarily third party, but opinions that really can distance themselves from the emotion of an exciting scientific discovery. Because if you buy into it too soon, if you drink the Kool-Aid too early, you can't really see what's going out in front of you. So the time to embrace reality is really at the very earliest stages. And that's just not an internal scientific conversation. It's also a patient conversation and a payer conversation and a ecosystem conversation to really understand what the echo response to your initial scientific aha moment is.
And Judy, I don't think your perspective is actually any different from the rest of us, even those much closer to commercialization. The challenge in small scientifically focused organizations is to have someone with your skill set at the table early enough to provide that perspective. Because my experience is when you have a bunch of scientists trying to do proof of concept, they're so focused on whether they can accomplish something. It's so technically challenging that they never ask the question whether they should. And you're at the table saying, if you can do this, then let me tell you whether or not you should, right? And that's a very, very important skill set to have early on at the table. It doesn't have to be a commercial officer. It can simply be a scientist that has that view, voicing that opinion.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all that feedback. Let's turn to the audience for some questions. Sarah's going to walk through some of the questions we've been getting and ask them from the panelists. So, Sarah.
Yeah, we've covered so many topics, so I thank you all for that. I think we could do different master classes on many subsectors of some of the discussions, but we've had a fairly engaged audience. And let me start off with a question that I don't think anybody has touched on yet. And excuse my little dog who's barking. How do you advise? The question is, what is your view about the role of corporate reputation in value creation? So that's a slightly different question than you've addressed already. So Gautam, why don't we start with you?
Sure. No, and I think the first kind of example that comes when I think about corporate value is bad actors, right? Of course, in our industry, sometimes we do have bad actors, and I think as a base case, it's important to make sure that your corporate reputation isn't such that you're perceived to be someone that isn't focusing ethically or focusing from a value perspective. So I do think that's important, just to be ethical in this industry. This industry often gets a lot of negative pressure. So I think ultimately leverage, and if you're focusing on value, that will actually build corporate value and corporate credibility as well. I don't know if others have other thoughts on that.
On the one hand, you've got Martin Ciccarelli, so we don't need to talk about that. I think from a more mainstream perspective, a lot of times companies, both big and small, simply they don't have the ability to answer the question that's asked. So, for example, when they're asked, why this price? Why is the list price X? They have a hard time verbalizing the middleman, PBM conversations, the impact of CMS decisions. And I recognize that pharmaceutical companies have to do business with these people. But ignoring the question, A, makes you sound oily, and two, it gives the people that should be part of that conversation a free pass, which is not the right way to go about these things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Wills or Judy?
Yeah, sorry, go on, Judy.
No, I was going to say, as I listened to the question, for me, reputation is value. And I think about, this February is Black History Month in the United States, and the conversation that has been swirling around the COVID vaccine is the historical poor reputation that biopharmaceutical companies have with the Black community because of the known just heinous things that were done to the Black community, either in withholding medicines or in utilizing the Black community as experiments. And so I think that for me, this whole concept of value is a corporate reputation, and corporate value is about that ability to speak your truth. And I agree, Peter, it's answering the questions that need to be answered. It's not dodging them, but it's also being able to engage with the communities because ultimately we develop medicines for people. And if we are going to be successful, then we want those people to trust us. And they trust us by trusting our medicines, our therapeutics. And I think that if you don't have that corporate reputation as part of your value statement, and the statement being that you're presenting therapies in the best interest of the medical community and with the patient in the center and with the patient in mind and for their health, then I don't think you have any longstanding ability to be a going concern as a biopharmaceutical company.
Yeah, but so the other day I was having a conversation about trial diversity with a bunch of CROs, and the response I got was, well, we don't need to do that. That's not required. Like, boy, is that the wrong answer.
Sure is. Wills, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And Judy, you've raised some extremely important points there. I believe that a stated commitment to bringing excellent therapies in a very good way to people who are waiting for them, irrespective of where they are and which part of the community they come from, is just, it has to be part. And I think our younger generations are even choosing which companies to work for based on probably different things than we were thinking about when we were going for our first job. I think the other thing is that talking early and talking often and talking honestly with your stakeholders, be it the regulators, be it the payers, be it the patients and the physicians, can actually be part of building your credibility as a company. And what's very interesting is if you go as a company very early and you have genuine conversations and ask the hard questions not dodging them, and be prepared to hear the answers and act on them, it is incredible how many partnerships you can form with stakeholders that have maybe been traditionally seen as the opposition in the history of our industry. So I think it's about having a clear mission statement and about a true commitment to achieving that. But the little steps and the actions can actually be part of building a very solid corporate reputation. And it's great to see that we've got so many people here who are focused on that.
What a great answer. Thank you all for that. Lorenz, we'll take you for another, with another question, okay? We're shifting gears a little bit here. This question is related to rules regarding pricing. The question reads, do the panelists believe the industry will evolve into a set of rules? For example, a gene therapy cure would be priced at the equivalent of 5 years of chronic treatment. What do you think? Gautam, why don't we start with you on that?
I think it's interesting. We talked around this construct a little bit in terms of the durability of things like gene therapy. So I do think that math, and we've talked about the math, is important. I think the challenge is when you get approved, are you going to be able to really claim 5 years of durability, or do you actually get approved with less than that from a durability perspective? So I think it's actually going to be a little bit more gray in terms of how that will actually happen, because I don't think there will be an ability to really show the math for a longer term or perspective. And I don't necessarily see it coming as a set of rules. I think it's a bit more of ICER and groups like NICE will need to continue to figure out, with the uncertainty you have, how do you price and how do you value? And it may come to innovative mechanisms like the Netflix model when you don't really know how effective or how durable a therapeutic will be. I don't know if others have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's an old joke that says two drug developers are talking, and one says, I'm developing a drug that if we hit our endpoint, it will give the patient immortality. And the other researcher says, great, I'll take the FDA forever to approve it. But I think what this points out is post-marketing data collection via real-world evidence and other type of mechanisms is going to be so crucial. Because you can't do an ongoing, rolling post-marketing clinical trial. You have to figure out through AI and machine learning and other mechanisms how to track what's actually happening in the real world and to extrapolate that to how long, how successfully, how durable, any one of these therapies is going to be.
Yeah, that gets to another question that's rolled in. I'm sorry if I've jumped in on anybody else who wanted to respond, but what about including outcomes from modeling real-world data to measure value? And maybe that, Lorenz, this is something that might be right up your alley, and then probably Judy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly no expert in real-world evidence. There's people that spend a career working on that, but I am on the fortunate side of being able to invest in people that have that ability. And it goes back to what we said earlier about defining value early on. So a lot of people assume that you can't really explore that until you have a lot of money because it costs millions of dollars and all that. And that's just not true. You can certainly spend millions, tens of millions of dollars collecting that kind of important evidence to defend or define the value of your product. But you can also early on, when you're in pre-phase one, phase one proof of concept work, you can spend tens of thousands or low hundreds of thousands with the incredible data sets that are available now, and primarily in the US, but also overseas, to be able to at least understand what the actual value might be from an economic standpoint. What is the cost of the existing standard of care? What are these patients going through? What are physicians going through? What are payers having to pay for? What's the healthcare resource use associated with that disease? That kind of stuff can be answered early on, at least to the point that was made earlier. I think maybe Judy made it, of getting to that go, no-go decision that, fail early. If you have a great scientific innovation that just is not going to pass muster on value, then being able to know that early on when you've only spent hundreds of thousands and you're not in phase 3 yet, and having spent $250 million in a phase 3 pivotal, it's super valuable, I think, to move the resources onto something that has a higher chance of success.
Okay. Yeah, we have so many questions coming in right now. Building upon that particular response, another viewer reached out and asked, they comment that today there are no disease-modifying drugs ever approved by the FDA. There are some symptom-modifying drugs in the market, but they are not effective, and there is no cure for Alzheimer's disease. Can you give some tips on how we can determine the price value of new AD drugs? That may be too specific for this group.
Alzheimer's, so the most successful Alzheimer's drugs now, all they do is they slow progress. And I say that's all they do. There's an enormous economic value in that, huge, enormous, and we don't give it the credit that it's due. I think that the way that you move beyond that is to reward incremental innovation. We're not going to solve, I wish we could solve Alzheimer's disease between one commercial break and the next like they do on television, but that's not the way it works in the real world. The way that you move beyond incremental benefit to disease-changing benefit is by rewarding small steps forward. And I think we underestimate the value of small innovations because of reimbursement problems. So reimbursement actually can get in the way of any given company's desire to invest in cool science.
So Alzheimer's disease is the perfect example of where the science and the business need to work together. Because in my opinion, I worked in Alzheimer's when I was at Pfizer, and the fundamental problem, and this is not just an issue with Alzheimer's, but specific to Alzheimer's, is we don't know what is the root cause of Alzheimer's disease. And so it's hard to innovate when you don't know what the problem is. So I agree, Peter, that incremental innovation is, I think, the stepwise pathway forward. But I think we also need to be very careful that we don't get ahead of our skis and that we don't look at talking about pricing disease-modifying Alzheimer's disease drugs when the science hasn't really been well characterized. And it's an uncomfortable and unfortunate statement of fact that we're just not there yet. I think the person who discerns the source of Alzheimer's disease should get the Nobel Peace in Medicine, Science, and then the Prix Gallienne when they did get their drug approved. That's a really hard area, and being specific to Alzheimer's disease, I don't know that there's a better answer than what Peter provided, but I also would be cautioned that we're not trying to do too much as it relates to that specific disease.
And Judy, I think that the underlying statement there is that's called telling the truth. So, when you talk about...
Anybody else want to jump in on that? If not, we have another question. In what situations would you not recommend a VBA?
I can go first with that. I think a value-based assessment is important essentially anytime in today's market, at least understanding kind of what the value of your drug, whatever you're developing is now. There's ways to think about how do you continue to maximize and further develop it as you're developing the drug and trying to refine that. Make sure you understand how you're developing and what endpoints you're pursuing in studies to be able to prove your value. But I don't know if I would suggest to any company now not to focus on value-based assessments.
Yes, that's my reaction. I'm sitting here gut-racking, trying to think of an example or a time where it wouldn't make sense, and I don't know that I could provide any example.
It's better to know it, right? If you don't know yourself, the payers and other groups are going to be looking at it from their perspective, right?
But one of the things I also wanted to call out, Lorenz, is what you said earlier in the context of real-world evidence and the effort. A lot of what we're talking here, particularly as you go through the pipeline, if you think about that early stage and into the later, it's an iterative process. And you're not going to pull out and do a full-blown value-based assessment, at your early stage before you've gone into a phase 1 study to know if you can even get into patients. So I think that there's a concept here of fit for purpose, a proportional response to what you're trying to understand and where you are in the drug development pipeline. And, I always see the pipeline as, your friend. Where are you? What's the question you're trying to answer? And based on that answer, what happens next? Because there's a big difference between making a commitment for a phase 1 study versus making a commitment to write the check for a phase 3 study and everything that portends.
Also the whole issue of platform trials. what can we learn about any given molecule across a spectrum of possibilities earlier on in the proposition?
Okay, can we, Lorenz, did you want to jump in, or can we move on to another question?
We can move on. That was a great discussion.
Okay, so one of our viewers asks, can you discuss what the most effective forms of virtual digital remote patient feedback are? So I think Judy, this is probably in your lap, and maybe Will's as well.
Oh, man.
They're asking hard questions, huh?
Yeah. No, but you told us that they would. I don't know that I've got some good examples. I don't work directly in patient advocacy or in communication, so I don't know that I have a really good answer to that. Lorenz, I don't know if you have any insights.
Well, I can tell you from my current job, the first commercial person I hired on the team after I was hired by our board was a patient advocacy person. And it's because we fundamentally wanted to create a culture in our company that put the patient first, and not just in words, but they had somebody that was always thinking about every decision we make, what does this mean for a patient? And so, there's been a lot of horrible things with COVID-19, but one of the things that's really advanced is the ability to do what we're doing right now, which is be in all remote locations and have a communication where you can hear everyone, you can see everyone, you can read body language. And so we're now, having put together a group of patients that we're targeting to help, measured in dozens or hundreds, we're now working with them to be able to put them on Zoom calls with our most senior leadership, potentially even with members of our board, so that they can all feel what it's like to have that disease and the impact of it directly from patients. So that's not necessarily patient advocacy. It's actually using patient experience in real time and the diversity of patient experience, leveraging this new technology that we've been able to pioneer over the last 5 or 10 years to really infuse everything we do with the patient perspective, so that ultimately the value is well understood for what is all of our ultimate customer, the patient that takes the drug.
Thank you, Lorenz. Wills, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was actually going to say exactly the same. This idea of bringing patients to come and spend time with the board and spend time with the entire company. So not just the team working on the therapy in question, but the finance team, the legal team, the people that welcome our visitors, because every single person in the company has a role to play in that, bringing that therapy to the patients, to the community that's waiting. And I think the technological possibilities have allowed us to transcend the physical limitations. So organizing a visit in a very small old building where the lift is constantly breaking down, that's tough when you're bringing someone in who's using a wheelchair. But being able to convene a patient panel using Zoom when there aren't dogs or cats in the background or children running through is a fabulous opportunity. If there is one flower that's grown on the dunghill that is COVID, I think our ability to be connected like this is something amazing.
Yeah. Ironically, so we recently had a patient panel to the same, and Sarah, you stumped me on this question because I'm sitting here thinking of all the different platforms, and I don't want to advocate any one of them, but I'll follow up with an example as well. We had a patient panel for a debilitating muscle disease, and over the course of 5 weeks, 6 patients living with this disease joined in a conversation with myself and 50 other Alexion colleagues. And one particular morning, one of the patients wasn't able to join. And we did not know that he wasn't going to be there. In mid-meeting, he joined in. What happened, he told us after, is that morning, he woke up with just debilitating muscle pain. He couldn't join. And so the thing that's been really powerful about Zoom is that he very quietly, without any fanfare, joined in the conversation and acted as if nothing ever happened. And so it really empowered him to join and participate. And it gave him the respect and courtesy to participate in the conversation on his terms and not on ours. So I agree with Lorenz and Wills. I hadn't really thought about the power of Zoom. It's been really powerful for us as well. And so if I have to advocate one platform, that's been something we've also been able to do at Alexion, is to engage with our patients and allow them to join us in the way that's comfortable for them.
And the same is true for the trial issues.
That's really powerful. Thank you all for that. here's a question, and Gautam, I think this may be in your ball court. Have you utilized hybrid qualitative, quantitative market research approach in the commercialization process, and you as a consultant, as an advisor to companies?
No, I think it's critical to get feedback from the different stakeholders, whether they be physicians, patients, or payers. And throughout that, we're often using a degree of the qualitative, quantitative, right? Kind of talking to them on the phone or on Zoom or doing an internet survey with them. I actually think there's a lot of value for talking rather than just doing an internet survey. But sometimes to get to the robust sample sizes you need, we do use those combination approaches. So we think it's important. I recommend that companies should think about those type of approaches. As soon as they start getting into the clinic, it's important to start to get feedback from users and payers.
Great, thank you. It's about time to wrap up. Wills, we have a very specific question for you. I'm sorry, everybody. Maybe we can do this very quickly. And the question is, based on your work with MoCA, could you please comment on the developments around pay for performance reimbursement in different European markets, and what are the key the key barriers in place? Wills, I think this is a question that should be taken maybe offline. Maybe we can engage you.
That's quite a big question, and I'd be happy.
That's not a short one.
I'd like to talk about that offline. So if the questioner would like to reach out to me directly, more than happy to do that.
We will do that. We will do that. We will put them in contact with you. In the meantime, we've come to the end of our discussion today. I do want to thank all of you for participating. Let's get the words out. This has really been an informative and dynamic discussion, and the questions keep coming in. So we have an actively engaged audience for all of you. Gautam, thank you for leading the discussion. Wills, Judy, Peter, Lorenz, thank you all for committing your time to sharing your experiences with our audience. Everybody's learned a lot from all of you today. I do want to thank you all. And for everybody who is listening, please join us for our next virtual salon. And I'd love to tell you the date, but I'm really bad at remembering dates. I show up. In any case, it is on our website, and we're focusing in on targeting mRNA for the next one. So I hope to see all of you there then. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks,
Bye from New York. Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.